If you were to create a business in a lab and you wanted it to be impossible to operate, it would look a lot like airlines, right? It's sort of the worst creation you think about a CFO seat. It's very difficult because
I don't envy you.
no,
Yeah.
it's not at all. It's a very highly fixed business. We have to operate very large assets that move around, and this idea that assets move around is really misunderstood. It's incredibly complex. I'm actually very surprised. We get an airplane to the gate with pilots and flight attendants. Maintenance has review the airplane. We get it fueled up. We get people on board the airplane. All those things happen at a fairly consistent clip. So very difficult to sort of operationally deal with, but financially, we have at the top line, revenue is at risk all the time. Like very few businesses are at risk. Like we have to sell every seat on every plane over and over and over and over and over again.
Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Thank you, Fat Joe, and welcome to Run the Numbers, where I interview world-class CFOs, operators, and the investors who fund them on how to get the most out of your company's performance. This podcast is a playbook of sorts for ambitious people in the worlds of finance, strategy, and operations. Today, my guest is Scott Haralson, the CFO of Spirit Airlines. He manages perhaps the most dynamic and complex operating model out of all the CFOs I've spoken to so far. It blew my mind how many moving parts there are, literally, when it comes to getting people to and from a destination on time. On this episode, we cover how Spirit makes money and trace their unbundling strategy into specific revenue line items, Spirit's North Star metric, operating costs per available seat mile, how he buckets the different costs in his model, and how he thinks about hedging for fuel, analyzing routes to determine contribution margin, just like you'd look at product lines in the SaaS world, Spirit's concentration on leisure travelers versus business travelers in understanding your ICP, and major capital allocation decisions, like buying planes. Interviewing Scott was a glimpse into a world that was completely foreign and extremely fascinating to me. There were so many ahas, like how you want to only buy planes that all your pilots can feasibly drive, the nuances in forecasting flight utilization, and pricing strategy to get the most out of every seat before the plane takes off. If you love business models, you'll love this one. All this and much, much more after a short word from our sponsors. Okay, serious question for all my accounting pros here today. Are you doing what you were hired to do? What I mean is, do you have time to actually be a business partner, or are you buried in tedious manual tasks just to get your journal entries prepared every month? I know how that feels. Leapfin's here to help with that. Leapfin is accounting automation software that automatically prepares and posts reliable journal entries. And that's just the beginning. High-growth businesses like Reddit, Canva, and SeatGeek choose Leapfin to eliminate manual tasks, accelerate month-end close, and enable accounting leaders like you to provide faster insights that will help your company grow. If you're battling messy transaction data from Stripe, Adyen, Shopify, Apple Pay, and other PSPs, and then battling again to get it all into NetSuite, go to leapfin.com to watch their short product intro video. And if you like what you see, request a 15-minute conversation to learn how accounting automation can help you and your team. Check out leapfin.com today. That's leap like jump, fin like shark. I just made that up. I hope they're okay with it. Leapfin.com. Financial operations are needlessly complex. Startups have to cobble together a patchwork of tools to reconcile transactions from different sources, work to get a holistic view of cash flow and how it maps to company priorities, and struggle to glean answers from platforms that speak different languages. Simplicity can transform your business operations. That's why Mercury powers your financial workflows from the bank account so you can pay bills faster, stay in control of company spend, and speed up reconciliation. Apply in minutes at mercury.com and join over 100,000 ambitious startups that trust Mercury. I like that. Not just for banking and credit cards, but for the precision, control, and focus they need to transform their financial workflows and perform at their best. Mercury, the art of simplified finances. Mercury is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services provided by Choice Financial Group and Evolve Bank and Trust. Members FDIC. I always wanted to do that voice. Scott, welcome to the Run the Numbers podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Great. Thanks, CJ. Thanks for having me.
So I've been catching up on earnings calls. I've been reading through your 10Ks. I feel like I know you in a way. I don't know if you've ever got that before. That's what the finance dorks say. They feel like they know a CFO from reading all the material.
All right. Good.
A term that came up a lot is ultra low cost carrier model. Can you just unpack what that phrase means?
Sure. I mean, I'm not a big fan of the moniker or the label because I think it has some implications that are probably a bit, misleading. But the main point around ultra low cost comes from the asset efficiency in production. So in our business, when we say low cost, we really mean low unit cost. So that's the miss word in this, and it's primarily an investor label because we sort of categorize carriers based on unit cost production. And so unit cost means how many units you are producing for your business. And so if you think about units for any business, if I'm manufacturing widgets, it's how many widgets can I produce for a given level of assets, right? So for us, it really comes down to two things. One is, we have an asset, we have an airplane. So how efficient are you at producing units? And units for airlines are called seat miles, right? And so it sort of tells you the two ways you can move the amount of units you produce. You can change the number of seats, or you can change the miles. And miles really means minutes you're flying, right? So if you think about low cost carriers have more seats on board the airplane, so slightly denser configuration, right? You could have 10 seats on an airplane, or you could have 200, and that would change the density and therefore the seat miles or the units produced. And you can also fly the airplane more minutes per day. So higher utilization carriers produce more ASMs. So ultra low cost carriers have more seats on the airplane and they fly the airplane a little more hours per day. And that primarily comes from the route networks. So how your network is set up. If you think about the larger carriers, Delta, American, United, they have less seats on their airplane because they have more premium seats on board. So like more first class means less seats, right? And they also fly a hub and spoke network, which means they fly them into their hub and they collect them and they sit for a bit and they do all the connections and then they fly back out. So myself, Spirit, Frontier, Southwest, we fly more of a point-to-point network, which means the aircraft goes city to city to city in sort of a daisy chain. And while you can do some connectivity in those cities where you have, a bigger amount of capacity, like for us, we're fairly sizable, and in Fort Lauderdale, Orlando, Las Vegas, we can have connections. We just don't typically schedule connections and slow down the operation for those. So they're trade-offs in how you set up your business. And there's reasons for those for both. But that's typically the unit production, which drives unit cost. So hope that's not too much airline nerd.
No, this is the inside baseball that people come to the podcast for.
Yeah.
Is cost per available seat mile a North Star metric for you?
Yeah, I mean that's the whole point. So you have your cost to run the business divided by the available seat miles. Your ASMs are the widgets you produce, or we produce.
Got it.
So we take our entire cost and you divide it by those units, and that's your unit cost measurement. And the same works for revenue. You have a total revenue per available seat mile. So it's the same concept. And the idea is that your revenue per seat mile is greater than your cost per seat mile, and there's your earnings and your margin, and there you go.
The math sounds simple when you break it down like that, but I know a lot goes into that.
It is fairly simple. It is not complex. The acronyms and the nomenclature make it more difficult. But once you understand it, it's pretty simple.
What's the difference between being cheap and low cost? Is there a philosophical difference between those two terms?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think cheap's a bad word. Cheap means it's low quality, it's not safe, those things, which are absolutely not the case for any airline, by the way, generally is not that way. We're all held to a very high regulatory safety standard, and every airline in the U.S. exceeds those standards. So U.S. carriers are very safe in any measure of safety. So cheap is not a word necessarily that you would think would be associated with airlines, but it is because it's used incorrectly. I think the better phrase may be thrifty, which every business should be thrifty. Which thrifty means you're really sensible about how you spend your money, right? You're not frivolous, and every business has a sense of that. Now, what I would say around the different models is that lower fare or lower cost to the consumer businesses generally means you will have lower complementary services or lesser complementary services, right? And so that's typically what you would find is, the carriers that you think are lower fare, like a Spirit, Frontier, Southwest, and even to an extent, the JetBlues of the world. We don't have lounges and, things at airports and more expensive features. So you sort of stack rank and figure out what's important to you as a consumer. Do you care about lounges, right? Or do you care about having the things that are important, like being on time, have a comfortable seat? We think doing things in an a la carte fashion provides people more options and the ability to sort of customize their travel. And we typically tailor to those that are leisure travelers, or at least those that act like leisure, those that pay for their own tickets. Small businesses act that way. They care about what they're paying for things. And typically corporate accounts, have probably a less affinity to cost than they do sort of features and mileage programs and those things, of which we all have those. But, Delta, United American have much more robust and sizable, mileage programs, and they sort of pay for those too.
I noticed that you break out your revenue in terms of what you get from that seat being booked, the butt in the seat, and then the a la carte options, right?
That's right. Yeah, we do. And then that's, more of a, an accounting and gap. And it's also part of the story too. So we are, we have, one component, which is fare, and that sort of puts your, butt in the seat. And the other components are optional, right? You can decide to buy a seat, buy a bag, and do those things. And a lot of people like to fly on Spirit because they can customize their, individual travel needs based on, where they're going or what they're going to do. Sometimes they only need a backpack. Sometimes they do care about having a certain seat. They're traveling with their family, or, they just want to sit on an aisle, or they want to travel in what I would call is the most, valuable piece of real estate, today in our fleet, which is our big front seat. So we offer a first class seat. You just don't get the additional services, but it's a fraction of the price. You might pay a, first class seat on Delta at $1,000, and you do get unlimited beverages and maybe a snack or two, maybe even a meal if it's long haul, probably a lower quality meal. Obviously, it's hard to have high quality meals on board an airplane, but for us, you can do it at a fraction of the price, and you can have the seat, and you can bring on your own water and soda and snacks and save hundreds of dollars. So it's the best value in the business today. But, part of our problem is not everybody knows about it. So we got to do a better job at marketing and branding and merchandising that product.
Is there anything out there that you wouldn't ever split out a la carte?
Yeah, I mean, there's things that you would think are sort of universal.
Would you ever charge for the bathroom or no?
No, that's been a long-standing joke, obviously, of, we'll give you free water, but just, to get in the bathroom, it's $20. But no, that's of course not the idea. The idea is so you can. It's not like people joke that the a la carte model is penalizing. It's not meant to be penalizing. It's meant to be customizable.
It's optionality, really, at its core.
It is optionality. So people, most people do understand. And while there are jokes about it, I think people do understand the value of optionality and customization, because overall, even after you layer in the components, on average, Spirit is dramatically cheaper than the big carriers. Now, there are some scenarios where that may not be the case, but a vast majority of the time, that is truly the case.
Scott, I want to dig into something you said about your ideal customer profile, your ICP. Mm-hmm. It sounded like you catered more towards leisure travelers. Can you explain how that may change the way you look at your business versus catering towards business travelers?
Well, sure. I mean, I think the desires and needs of leisure travelers are different than those of business travel. For example, business travel may care more about frequency in a market, for example. A business traveler that's in New York probably care, and they're going to go to Miami. They care about the number of departures per day because they may need to adjust their schedule. And, they booked a flight at 5 p.m., but maybe they're available to go at 2 p.m. And, that sort of matters. So they have a different sort of schedule desire, and they care more about things like Wi-Fi being included, or lounges and these things that are different, and maybe loyalty programs as well. And I think leisure carriers tend to be more price sensitive, and they care more about sort of that customization. How can I use it to my benefit to be efficient in how I travel?
That makes sense. And you see it that way of how you allow them to add on kind of modules, if you will, based on what they want their experience to be. Whereas if I'm a business traveler, like I care about how much the company spends on me, but like not probably in the same way as much as, my boss would like for me to think that I care about it.
Absolutely. And that's just totally natural. I mean, you spend your own money, you do care about it in a different way.
Did you say that it also impacts the way you think about the flight schedules, like what time planes fly?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think leisure travelers travel at different, periods of the day sometimes, but they also don't care as much about frequency. So we have 200 airplanes today. Delta has, probably more than 1,000. So, they may be able to have 10 flights a day between two destinations. It's more valuable for us to have 2 or 3 flights a day and travel to 100 destinations, Caribbean and leisure, big city leisure across the network, to have breadth in the network as opposed to concentration. So those are trade-offs that you'll make in your network and city selection.
Yeah, I was flying out of the Fort Myers airport recently, and I took Spirit to Nashville, and it was at a much better price than everybody else. There was only one flight that day, though, and that flight worked for me that day, so it was okay.
Right. Yeah. So you make decisions as an airline. Look, I can't afford to have 5 to 10 flights a day going from Fort Myers to Nashville. It just wouldn't work, right? I would need to reallocate that capacity to other cities where it'd be more valuable for me to do that. So we are just like every person. We have a limited amount of resources that we have to allocate in the most efficient way possible.
Got it. And planes on the ground don't make money. You said you have 200 planes. How does flight utilization impact your business model?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, flight utilization is critical to the ASM production, the efficiency production of the airline. So we want the airplanes flying. Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
But we want them to be able to fly in a way that makes money. And so we have to figure out a way to one, fly them in the most useful utilization structure, but also the downside to, I shouldn't say downside, you're limited in the number of hours per day that you have, right? We have 24 hours in a day. And some of those minutes have to be used for cleaning the airplane, what we call turning the airplane, which is it arrives in a destination and then we'll leave again to go to another destination. Those are minutes on the ground that we have to turn and prepare the plane for, the next flight. So those turns are minutes that they cost money. And then also every evening, the airplane has to have maintenance on it. So there has to be downtime, for the airplane to get sort of refreshed and ready for the next day of flying. So you have to allocate your minutes in a given day.
Is one of the metrics you track, like how long it takes to turn a plane from like when it lands, when it takes off again?
Of course. Absolutely. That's a critical metric for every airline. I mean, like I said, minutes are money, and anytime it's on the ground, it's not making money. So the faster you can turn an airplane, the better off you are.
Are there any weird nuances that I wouldn't know from the outside on how you do it faster? Like, are the seats made of like a special material that's easier to clean or something odd like that?
No, I mean, what the biggest constraint in that is typically 2 things. One, getting the people off the airplane and getting the people on the airplane. There are other things that happen in the background, like your crew. They have a special script of things they have to do. Pilots have to do their, flight pre-checks. They got to do the walk around for the airplane, make sure that there's nothing wrong. So they go down on the bottom underneath the airplane and check, making sure there's a visual inspection on, landing gear, wings, and all the components, and making sure that everything's in place. And a number of times pilots will find issues that, say, for example, there was a, what we call FOD. So say you hit a bird on the way in and the other crew didn't really know it. It was maybe a glancing blow, but the other crew noticed a small dent or a feather, and it may require, an inspection from maintenance. So these things happen all in the background of when, a plane is processing for the next flight. And so, but the biggest constraint usually is getting people off the plane. So what we want to do is have an efficient, onboarding and offboarding process, and that is constrained a lot of times by the number of bags coming on board the airplane, the number of children, the number of wheelchairs, all these sorts of things do create, constraints in having an efficient process, for all those.
So I have 2 kids under 2. You let me board before some other people. Is that not being nice, but that's just an efficiency play?
Right. Of course. Honestly, if you were, a parent, I would say board me last because I want to spend fewest amount of minutes.
I don't want to be in that thing for any longer.
Exactly, but it's obviously hard to get car seats on board the airplane, get kids settled when there's people in the aisle and all those things. So it is a bit of an efficiency play. I mean, that's what you as a passenger probably want. That's what all of us want, is to get everything up and moving and be gone as fast as possible.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Quick math: the less your business spends on operations, on multiple systems, on delivering your product or service, the more margin you have and the more money you keep. That's the goal, isn't it? But with higher expenses on materials, employees, distribution, and borrowing, everything costs more. Yesterday's price is not today's price. So to reduce costs and headaches, smart businesses are graduating to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one platform and one source of truth. With NetSuite, you reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud with no hardware required. Access from anywhere. You cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems because you've got one unified business management suite. You improve efficiency by bringing all your major business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors. Over 37,000 companies, wow, that's a lot of customers, have already made the move. So do the math. See how you'll profit with NetSuite. And back by popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. Head to netsuite.com/metrics. That is netsuite.com/metrics. Ooh, yeah, your boy loves some metrics. That's netsuite.com/metrics. Please do it, guys. I really need this. Cash is king. As the CFO of a SaaS company, I know firsthand how important it is to maintain a healthy AR balance. If you can't effectively manage cash, you can't service debt, make payroll, or invest in growing your business. That's why I'm so excited to partner with the sponsor of today's episode, Maxio, the leading billing and financial operations platform for B2B SaaS. Maxio helps top SaaS companies like Chili Piper, Crunchbase, and Stack Overflow get cash in the door faster by automating collections and dunning. Gone are the days of manually chasing down invoices. Join the 2,500 plus subscription businesses using Maxio, formerly SaaS Optics and Chargeify, to eliminate revenue leakage and streamline order to cash. It's never been easier to get paid. Visit maxio.com/run the numbers to supercharge your financial operations in 2024. Not only does requesting a demo using the Run the Numbers link help support this podcast, ya boy, you also receive a 10% discount on your first year with Maxio. Woo! That's maxio.com/run the numbers. That's maxio.com/run the numbers. Scott, I want to talk about how you forecast for your business. You have more variables than probably any CFO with a business model I've spoken to so far. Right. You sit down with your FP&A team at the start of the year. I guess the first question would be, what are even the revenue lines that you're forecasting for? Do you unbundle those just like how you sell?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, we forecast all of those things. But it generally starts with, well, look, I'll make a broad statement in that, the airline industry is terrible in a lot of ways, right? Okay. It's a lot of fun. It's a fast moving business with a lot of challenges, and it's a high profile business. People all know the airlines, and they know when you mess up, and so it's definitely in the limelight, probably too much if you ask me. But it's a very difficult business to forecast. Like if you were to create a business in a lab and you wanted it to be impossible to operate, it would look a lot like airlines, right? It's sort of the worst creation you think about a CFO seat. It's very difficult because
I don't envy you. Yeah,
no, it's not at all. It's a very highly fixed business. We have to operate very large assets that move around, and this idea that assets move around is really misunderstood. It's incredibly complex. I'm actually very surprised. We get an airplane to the gate with pilots and flight attendants. Maintenance has reviewed the airplane. We get it fueled up. We get people on board the airplane. All those things happen at a fairly consistent clip. And we're generally on time, complete almost all the flights, right? And we have to deal with weather, other regulatory constraints around the FAA every day, the air traffic control, airport congestion, airport issues. And we rely on a lot of third parties to make all those things happen. We have fuelers and other components and bag handlers and gate agents and all these things that we need to all show up at the same time and all be coordinated and all for that to happen at a regular clip. So very difficult to sort of operationally deal with, but financially we have at the top line, revenue is at risk all the time. Like very few businesses are at risk. Like we have to sell every seat on every plane over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, because it goes away if you don't fill that seat. Like that inventory doesn't come back.
It expires, right? So it's that expiring inventory is a difficult revenue maximization component. It's like, sort of, you think of other businesses that have similar concepts, like hotels, have expiring inventory. If it's nobody's in that room that night, it goes away. But that asset doesn't move around. It sits there and it has a location on the block that's not going to move out from underneath them. And they're not, affected by the weather and the FAA and all the things the way we are. So there are other components, logistics, cargo has a similar component to this, but they carry boxes and not people. We carry very high anxiety people that are using, our airplanes to get to a destination, usually for, a real important reason. Nobody says, you know what, I want to go get on a plane and fly around and come back home because I have nothing to do. Doesn't work that way, right? They're going on a business trip or a vacation and going to see family. And so these things are high anxiety moments. And, obviously you've probably been on an airplane or seen video of people, that are, when they're in high anxiety situations, they may act differently than they might normally do. So that creates another layer of complexity on board the airplane. But financing all of these things or forecasting all of these things from a financial perspective is very difficult, right? A lot of moving pieces, but it takes a highly diligent financial process to do. So we don't just budget one time a year and let it sit. This is a constantly, sort of a continuous improvement kind of concept. So we are always rebudgeting or reforecasting the business. And that, in fact, we do it every week.
Every week?
Every week.
Wow. And I come from the tech world where our revenue is linked to an atomic unit, which is the sales rep, and we go out from there. And there are other people costs like attached to it. We call it pod. Yep. Do you forecast like starting with an airplane, or like what's the starting point usually?
Yeah, typically we forecast all the components. Primarily, you think about them in the two buckets: fare and non-ticket or non-fare. Okay. Seats and bags and all those things. And we do it by route, and that's by the two points in destination, time of day. All these things, because they all have different profiles. So the, peak times of the day when people want to travel, if it's say 8 a.m. or noon or 6 p.m., those generally have different revenue profiles than the 11 p.m. flight or the 5 a.m. flight, right? They have different profiles. So you have to forecast based on your network and where you're going, time of day, all those things. So it's a pretty detailed sort of revenue forecast build.
And then do you forecast like an attach rate of like on average every third person like has a bag they check and every fifth person, buys, Cracker Jacks on board or something?
Yeah, we certainly do. We have a percentage and attach rate to all those. We have, and another variable is called load factor, like how many seats are sold, on board the airplane. And so load factor. And so when you're thinking about revenue optimization, you're managing two things. One is the sort of revenue or cost per seat concept, but it's also how many seats you sell, right? Because I could lower the price, but I could sell more seats. I could raise the price and sell less seats. And so how do you optimize the sort of load factor / revenue per seat concept? And that's what revenue management and yield management does, on board airlines.
Do all your planes at least have the same number of seats to make it easier on you?
Well, the same type of aircraft does. So we fly, and this is one of the components of sort of lower cost airlines, is they run a simple fleet. Like we have one family of aircraft. So we have an Airbus A320 family of aircraft, and that family means that the same pilot can fly all three types because the cockpits are the same, avionics are the same, right? And so pilots and crew and all those things are very expensive. And so having the same aircraft type means I can, have pilots that can move in between aircraft. And so the 319, 320, and 321 are a family of aircraft. They are different sizes. This is part of managing cost too, is we
The lights go off during the podcast to save a couple bucks.
Yeah, if you don't move. Yeah. So it's so the point of the simplification is having the same fleet. So we have 319s that have 145 seats. We have 320s that have 182 seats, and 321s, which are the largest on our fleet, have about 230-ish, depending on the different variants, number of seats on board.
Scott, do you try to get to like a contribution margin per flight? Do you get down to that level of like, I hope I make this, like I'm making it up 10% per flight in profit or something?
Sure. I mean, we absolutely do. So contribution margin in our business means just the sort of the revenue minus the direct cost of that flight. How much does it contribute to cover our fixed cost, which are pretty sizable in airlines? So yeah, I mean, we obviously want to maximize all of those. And in any flight that doesn't contribute at all, like if it has a zero or negative contribution margin, those flights should absolutely go away, because they're actually making it worse on the business. They're not covering any bit of fixed, right? They're not even covering their variable, like the pilots and landing fees and fuel and those things, not even contributing to the cost of the airplane or the cost of the infrastructure needed to operate the business. So,
Scott, are you the guy who sits down at the end of each month or quarter and says, guys, this Fort Myers to Nashville, like the math doesn't hang here. We can't be doing that. Do you have to look at those?
I'm one of them. Yeah, we call it flight profitability reports. And
Okay.
and our, everybody cares about those. Our CEO, CFO, the chief commercial, chief operating officer, we all care about those things. And so we do sit down as a group, and usually what happens is, one flight doesn't make it go away, or even 1 month. If the network team thinks this route will build over time, you typically will invest in a route, which means that it may not make money the first day you fly it, but over time it should. But if there are routes that have been flying for a while that still aren't producing, they need to be cut away. I mean, look, in a given network, 100% of your flights are not going to be profitable. Like you're going to, have to assume that there's going to be some that aren't going to work, but that's network planning's job, is to continue to evaluate and call those flights that don't work, add in new ones that do. And that's sort of the constant evolution of network planning.
Will you ever run a flight that isn't making money because it's like a strategic advantage to be in that market?
Yeah, I mean, whenever you hear the word strategic like that, I mean, you better put your ears up, because that usually means you're losing money, and people think there might be another reason to do it. But there's very few of those around. Typically, you gotta earn your way in.
Spoken like a true finance guy. I respect that. Scott, can we talk about the costs that go into your business? So
Sure.
In the tech world, 75% of the costs walk on two legs. I'm guessing your mix is a bit different, considering jet fuel isn't all that cheap, and the plane.
Yeah, I mean, your two largest are always going to be fuel and labor, and depending on fuel cost and labor rates, they can sometimes move one or two. But for the last handful of years, it's been fuel. Fuel is the most expensive input to the business, and today it probably accounts for more than 30% of the expense.
Got it. So 1/3 is gas.
Yeah, and then another probably third or so, probably 25% today, and that 25 to 30% is going to be labor. And that labor includes all of the labor: pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, gate agents, ramp agents, all the other components. We have dispatchers, and plus we also have to have, all of the general and administrative functions. We have to have finance and accounting and marketing and HR and all those functions, as well as operational support functions. Like we have, a very sizable maintenance team that don't turn wrenches, right? They're high-tech engineers that, have to maintain records for their airplanes. And so there's an extremely large back office function for all of these things that most people don't, appreciate. And, so the fixed costs in the business are very sizable. And then, beyond that, you have the cost of airplanes, which is very large. And then the other, sort of airport components are extremely expensive. Landing fees are not cheap. So airports charge us to land the airplane.
I didn't know that. Can you say more about that?
Well, so this is an interesting piece that people probably don't understand, is that airports are a sort of flow through business. So they don't make money. Airports don't make money. So all of their expenses get passed through to the airlines. So they charge us for all these things. So you as a consumer contribute to paying for airports. Every time you fly into an airport, part of your expenses, which we generate as revenue, we have to pay to the airport. So they're flow through, completely pass through. So during COVID, when half of the flights were coming in, that means our expenses were doubled at the airport.
Wow.
So people don't truly understand the impact of how operational efficiency at the airport impacts all those things. So we have to pay for those things. So when other airlines reduce flights at an airport, that means the rest of the people there have to pick up the pieces.
Stupid question, maybe. Are airports owned by the state or city they're in, or are some of them privately owned?
Most of them in the U.S. are owned and operated by municipalities or cities or states or whatever that may be. They're pseudo governmental entities, but they're all pass through in most forms. There are some that do operate, beyond that. But if you think about like food and beverage and all the concessions, those do help offset expenses because those people that have concessions there have to pay the airport.
Oh, got it. Something about headcount planning that I didn't fully appreciate is you have to plan for not only people who are your headcount moves day to day. They don't just go to one office, and then you have to plan to put headcount feet on the ground within all the airports that you serve as well. That's like 10-dimensional chess.
Yeah, there's a lot of dimensions to what we have to do. I mean, each airport is sort of its own business, right?
Is that how you think about it? Each airport is kind of its own pod that you have to surround with like the service resources to support it?
Yep, absolutely. They all operate slightly different. They all have different sort of labor market supply and demand components. They all have different regulations. Some have different living wage ordinances that create minimum barriers at what you have to pay people at certain airports, which are generally higher than minimum wage in other areas. So yeah, I mean, there are each city and state has different regulations around how you do most of those things, but you have to absolutely think about them differently.
Mm-hmm. And then, not to add another wrinkle to your forecasting, but the airline industry is heavily unionized, right?
Yes, it is.
So you have to deal with that too, of the demands or requirements for, say, pilots versus flight attendants.
Yep, and I'm going to be careful to tread lightly on commentary around unions, but they do have a certain level of management that we have to consider because they do have work rules and things that we can and can't do and how we use them, and they obviously have negotiated pay rates that don't get changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you were to look at your headcount at Spirit, what's like the number one position in terms of number of people? Is it pilots or is it ground crew? How does it look?
Yeah, pilots are our number one. Actually, from a dollar amount, or you mean the count?
I guess both. So dollar amount, I guess it's pilots probably.
Dollar amount, it's pilots. From just a count, it would be flight attendants.
Flight attendants, and so you have to staff each plane probably requires 2 pilots, X number of flight attendants, and the list goes on.
Yeah, there's regulatory requirements on the number of flight attendants. So every 50 passengers, you have to have a flight attendant. So if you have 150, you need 3. If you have 151 to 200, you need 4. 201 to 249, 250 is 5, and that's the way it works.
I love the ratios. Just as a finance guy, like you can think of each one as its own unit.
That's not mine. That's the FAA, and it's the way it operates. So.
I was looking at your resume. You've been around the block in terms of this industry. I want to talk about navigating economic cycles and volatility because, like you said, you don't operate in a bubble. You don't operate in a vacuum. And the airline industry is highly sensitive to economic cycles and external shocks. How do you as CFO manage these types of risks? What's your mentality?
Yeah, it's a great question because you stay in the business long enough and you understand it's not a matter of if there's going to be distress in the business. It's a matter of when. And it's how do you set the business up to manage those shocks, right? And there are a number of ways you can do that. One, obviously, is your margin production. So the more profitable you are, the more shock absorber you have in the business. If fuel spikes, you have margin to do that. But typically airlines are lower margin, if any margin business, and not to give you the history of airlines, but since deregulation in 1978, the collective airline industry has made negative money, negative profits.
Say more about that. How does that impact your business model?
Well, I mean, it makes you think about risk,
Yeah.
obviously. Again, it's not a matter of if, it's when distress will happen. And even through COVID, we thought we had a fairly resilient, model in business. But you learn a lot of things during COVID that maybe, we could probably have managed, 95 or 99% of the risk scenarios that would have played out. But if I would have gone to my board before COVID and said, hey, I think we need to alter the business because of this infinitesimally small probability of a virus canceling, the industry or bringing our economy to a halt or all these sorts of things, they would have probably shown me the door, right? So you have to sort of assess risk in terms of probabilities and the effect of altering your business for that probability of effect, right? So there's these sort of black swan events that are extremely improbable to forecast for. So I could have never prepared the business for an event like COVID because it halted, stopped almost completely the airline industry for an extended period of time. And even the build back was very difficult. So COVID was a completely life altering experience for airlines. We had to go borrow a lot of money to pay for it.
Your business in many ways is controlled by these tail events that people don't expect.
Absolutely. Yep. These sort of unpredictable events and even, sort of things like the great financial crisis, but we are extremely influenced by, volatility of input costs, biggest one obviously being fuel. Mm-hmm. And people think, oh, well, why don't you just hedge? Right. And so hedging is one of the sort of confusing concepts for people because they think, oh, hedging means that you're going to pay less for fuel. And that is not the case. You sort of hope you hedge and that it helps reduce the volatility of risk or volatility of pricing for fuel, but it's not the case either. What happens is you actually end up paying more for fuel over the long term because it costs money to hedge, right? You have to pay premiums for the options and the protection that you're putting in place. So what happens is you pay cost of fuel plus, and assuming that you're not a speculator, that you're trying to win. You're not trying to win. Hedging for us would be reduced volatility, and I'm going to win some, lose some, right? Sort of over the long term is that you hope you come out even. But what happens is you end up paying premiums for the protection, the calls or options or collars or whatever you put in place. They cost money. So what you've done then is artificially just increased, not even really artificially,
right,
factually increased the cost of fuel over the long term of the airline. And so unless you are a speculator and you are trying to win, meaning you're taking a bet on fuel pricing, then that's a different game. We're trying to say all we want to do is sort of maintain and reduce the sort of spikes. But what you do is you do sometimes introduce more volatility in the cost of fuel, because if fuel price stay flat and you've introduced, option pricing, you've made the costs go up. So you've created volatility when there was no volatility, but it does help reduce the volatility extent when there's really large swings, but you got to be on the right side of that piece for it to work out for you. So it creates a lot of complexity, and hedging is not the end all be all solution to, price volatility either. Right.
You just put my brain in a pretzel. The way that I simply try to think about hedging is I'm willing to pay more to be more certain about what my cost is tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah, you are certain, but you're also locking in a number that may or may not be what spot is. So you're if you constantly layer in hedges, right? You're locking in a price. Spot, you're locking in a price too, right? You're just sort of doing it in different ways, right? And so you've just artificially increased the total cost. Like as somebody that's going to play the option game, you try to win, right?
Yeah.
You try to win. That's a different game to play than what airlines are doing. You're
just trying to operate. You're not trying to win.
No, it's earnings management. You're trying to say, okay, I mean, the sort of general philosophy for airlines is that, I'm selling a ticket 60 days out, right? And I'm selling that ticket at, say $200. And I would like to sort of associate a fixed amount of cost with that ticket so that I know I can make money on it. So I'll buy fuel today at 60 days out, right? So I can say, okay, here's my cost of fuel for that ticket that I sold, right? But if spot stays low, then
Yeah.
I've just increased the price of fuel that I didn't need to introduce during that period. So the whole point is that, and a lot of airlines have gone this way, which they've said, okay, I'm either going to like hedge fuel all the time, no matter what, at a certain percentage of my fuel uptake. Maybe it's 10, maybe it's 25, maybe it's 50% of my fuel uptake. Now, again, the more you hedge, the more expensive it gets. So if I were to hedge 100% of my fuel uptake, that's going to be millions of dollars of cost in puts and calls and collars and all these things that I would have to do. And I've introduced a lot of volatility into my business. Like most airlines will hedge a portion, 10, 20, 30% of their fuel uptake, right? Or they don't hedge at all. Like America,
They're either in the game or they're not in the game.
yeah, you're in the game and you're consistent, because once you move it around, then you start creating even more volatility, right? So a lot of airlines have said, no, I'm done. I'm out of the game. It's not a good idea. American, they don't really do it anymore. We don't do it. Frontier, I don't think a lot of, there's a few that still do. Southwest made a lot of money in the sort of early 2000s when they put long-term hedges in and paid off. So they're sort of baked. They sort of have to do it as part of their philosophy. But, I think Alaska still does, but most airlines are sort of like, I'm out of the game.
I love how certain airlines have different philosophies on it. It's like option trading in a way.
Right.
We touched on two of the three big buckets of costs. We touched on labor. We touched on fuel. I want to ask you about buying planes. So planes, they aren't cheap. How do you weigh capital intensive decisions, especially fleet management? Do you use any frameworks that are helpful?
Yeah, I'll introduce another component that makes buying airplanes even more difficult, which is you just don't show up at a lot and buy airplanes, right?
There's no used car lot for airplanes.
There's no car lot for airplanes. So if I want to buy a new airplane, and historically that's the best way to acquire a vast majority of your fleet, is to place an order with the manufacturers. Because typically the used airplane market is sort of hit or miss. Like, it's hard to find airplanes. Plus, in order to find a used airplane, you have to then reconfigure that airplane to fit in your system, which costs a lot of money. So that transitioning a used airplane into your fleet isn't cheap and requires a certain level of knowledge and skills and infrastructure to do that. So we have primarily used new airplanes as our vehicle for growth and supplemented occasionally with new ones. But if you want to buy new, then you have to go place an order with the manufacturer, and that has a very long lead time. And
what's the lead time on that? Is it in
years?
Yeah,
definitely in years. Historically, it's been probably 4 to 5 years. Today, Airbus, which is what we fly, they're sold out until 2030, 2031. So if you want anything sizable, you got to go place. So this is the advanced notification. So you have to make a bet into the future for most of your airplane needs. So fleet forecasting, growth, and all those things are very difficult because you have to make a bet in the future. And you don't know what the world's going to look like when you take delivery of those airplanes. So the airplanes that we took during COVID, we ordered back in 2019. When the world was good, we were fine. We placed an order for 100 plus airplanes that would deliver between sort of 2022 and 2027. And then we go into COVID, and, Airbus is like, well, I'm making your airplanes, so here it is, and I'm, obviously I'd rather not have it because I'm not flying any airplanes during COVID, but I still had to take delivery. I have a commitment and, contractual obligation to take the airplanes. So it creates, obviously a very difficult environment to sort of forecast your fleet needs. But, you have growth you have to calculate for, but also the replacement of aircraft that you have in your fleet that will eventually get retired. And so you have to make a retirement decision on airplanes. And, those are all complex to do.
I thought trying to budget for laptop refreshes was hard. This is a bit more tricky.
Yeah.
How much does the average plane run nowadays, just to ballpark a cost on one of these things?
Well, you could probably say, I don't know, $50 plus million for a narrow body airplane. Maybe it's closer to $100 million for a wide body.
Cool. That's not cheap.
But the one thing that you have to think about with airplanes is that, and it's sort of like a printer model, which is you buy the airplane and the engines, but a lot of the cost comes in maintenance. right? And or the ink, that you buy for printer, right? They sell you the cheap printer, but you got to pay, $50 for ink, every periodically, whatever. So it's the same concept for airplanes. Like you buy the airplane and the engines, but it costs you, 2-3x that over the life of it to maintain it.
Right. Right. So the maintenance cost is actually much more than the actual cost for the physical airplane.
That's right. So when we buy an engine from Pratt and Whitney to power the airplane, they sell us the engine, but we also sign up for a maintenance contract that's, 2-3x the cost of the engine.
They probably make much more margin on that actually than the engine.
They do.
The dirty secret. I wanted to ask you one question around revenue management and dynamic pricing. It's come up in pockets throughout our conversation, but airlines are really pioneers in dynamic pricing. We had talked with Rich Gotham, who's the president of the Boston Celtics, and I'd asked him a similar question about dynamic pricing, because a lot of software companies are getting more into this now, but I feel like sports arenas and airlines were really the pioneers behind it. So how do you think about pricing at Spirit Airlines? Do you have a team that just concentrates on that all day?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The evolution of dynamic pricing started really back in the 80s. American Airlines, the old American Airlines back in the 80s probably pioneered the idea of dynamic pricing. But the idea is that, you have limited inventory and expiring inventory, so you have to maximize the revenue. It's a supply demand equation. That supply, that seat is finite, which means like that seat that flies out of Las Vegas to Fort Lauderdale for us on Sunday night, there's a lot of people that want to leave Las Vegas on Sunday, right? And that flight should be a lot more expensive than the one that leaves Monday morning at 6 a.m., right? Which very few people want to take that flight. So it's a supply demand mechanism. So that's the general theory. And so then how do I maximize pricing when there's a high supply demand mismatch, right? Because if I priced everything the same all the time, the airlines wouldn't exist. You would just you'd never make money, right? So I have to, when times are good, I have to make hay, because when times are bad, I'm not making money at all.
Yeah.
So they just wouldn't exist if there was common pricing across the board. Because nobody would fly if it was $500 all the time, making this up. Nobody would fly on Tuesday, Wednesday, because those marginal flights just are like, they're sort of throwaways, and maybe you get some corporate travel a little bit, but the airlines would never make enough money. So you got to price it in a way that people make decisions. For example, like if you have any flexibility in your schedule and you're like, oh, it's $1,000 on Sunday. Well, I'd like to do Sunday, but I have a little flexibility, and I could fly Monday for, a fraction of that price. So that's how you get people to reallocate their schedules and fill in the gap that way. So it's a way to get people to move around for those that do have flexibility.
That's interesting.
And those that don't have flexibility, they're willing to pay that premium. So it's just a way to reallocate the sort of resources in the system, right? It's no different than you think, like, for example, utility companies. Like there was a utility place where I used to live. They used to incentivize people to wash dishes at certain times of night. Right? They would say, okay, or even electricity, right? Same concept, which is, there's a big electricity pole at 6 p.m., right? And a big water pole at 6 p.m., right? And so they're like, okay, well, I'll make water more expensive at 6, but I'll make it cheaper at midnight or 6 a.m. or, And so it's just a way for businesses to reallocate pools. And it's probably the same for, you think about computers, or even like, if it was the same way for, cellular, right? If they made data more expensive at certain times of day, if there was a limit on that capacity, like that's a way to think about reallocation of your sort of resources. But that's the idea.
I like how you talk about pricing that way. It's kind of like, it's not the end all be all. It's actually a tool to move around supply and demand.
That's exactly what you're trying to do, right? Because you want to level things out. You want every flight to make money, not just because honestly, if I have a flight that leaving out Sunday, from Vegas, that flight would really have revenue potential of say $100,000, which if you think about revenue per departure, we probably generate, 15 to 20,000 per departure. That's it, by the way.
Wow. That's lower than I thought.
Yeah. Per departure, it's only $15 to $20,000. And so if that flight had a unlimited, uncapped potential of say $100,000, so many people want to fly it. It's like it's in my best interest to get part of those people to move over to another time, right? So I can price them out to get them to move, right? Incentivize them to go to other, places where there's more capacity, right? And still
Yeah.
generate the maximum amount of revenue for that flight because I only have a fixed number of seats. Like I can't carry everybody that I want to, right?
Right.
Yep.
You don't want to make your whole nut on 3 flights. You want to peanut butter spread it over as many as possible to optimize it.
Right. Because if you think about it, it's like a fuel tank, right? I can only put 20 gallons of fuel in my tank, right? But if I have supply of 50, then the other 30 gallons just get washed away. What I'd rather do is I'd rather take that 30 and put it into other cars, right?
Yeah.
And that's the same sort of concept is that I can, if I price it correctly, I can get people to move around and still optimize my one departure. And
Scott, gearing towards a close, I'm going to take you into what we call our long ass lightning round. So I ask every CFO and leader I talk to, what's an example of something you've screwed up in your career? We're all human.
Oh yeah, I mean I make mistakes every day. Most of it is generally on smaller things. I can't recall a catastrophic event that have made me. You typically set up business and decision making in a way that you can't have that. I mean, there's other people that you sort of talk to with decisions around that stuff. But yeah, I mean, I've probably messed up models, but most of it's probably sort of career thoughts or even decision making from my own personal items.
Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I probably left jobs for bad reasons or, chased money or, didn't really know what I wanted and, that kind of stuff.
If you could tell your younger self something knowing what you know today, what would you tell him?
Ooh, focus on technology, even though I'm okay in that space, not great, better understanding of that stuff. But also, too, it's probably understanding what really matters, in your life today. There's going to be a lot of times when you get older or even, when you retire where you'll say, wow, I worried about a lot of things that really didn't even matter. And I didn't dedicate the time to the things that really did. Right. And so and that's just wisdom. It's really hard to tell your younger self or younger people those things, but you'll make enough money if you do the right things. So you don't have to chase it. And then make sure you tell your family you love them and you call your mom and your dad and all those things, and have friends and, be nice to your wife or your husband, your spouse, like, all the things that, you look back, you're like, wow, I was an asshole or whatever, like those kinds of things, like, take care of the people around you and the good things will happen. And
that's a good one.
Don't sweat the small stuff,
It's hard in the moment though.
It is hard. It is hard. Just be nice. If you're a nice person, the world comes to you. So,
There we go. You mentioned technology. Can you walk me through your finance software stack? What does your team use to get the job done?
Yeah, I mean, our ERP system, we use SAP, which is probably a little too powerful for what we use. It's like having a Corvette in the driveway for us. It's just a little too much. You're riding around the neighborhood in a Corvette kind of concept. But we use that. We use BPM. We're about to layer on some more, FP&A tools that give us a little more robustness. The Power BI and Tableau's data visualization stuff that's very helpful. The next step for us is probably doing a little more with the analytics and, predictive analytics, machine learning type stuff, which we've already kind of dipped our toe into a lot of these things. But that's where the blend of FP&A and data science start coming together. Honestly, I think that's next level for us because if you think about airlines, we do a lot of the same things over and over and over again. So, we have a ton of data and you can really get good at predictive analytics and letting the machine sort of tell you where you're inefficient and, how you can think about scheduling and your network and all these things could be very ripe opportunities for us. And that's sort of the next level. But, today we have, I think all airlines have way more insights today than we used to have. And we have the ability to make more, scalpel decisions than we did historically. Like you said, I use that phrase a lot, which is the peanut butter spread solutions, because, you sort of think, oh, okay, well, my flights in this area aren't, they're not on time enough. We're having issues, and so you think, okay, well, I need to put some buffer and and kind of peanut butter spread a solution. But what I'd really like to do is to know exactly where the problem is and what the exact solution should be to fix that one piece, so I can put a Band-Aid on the cut and not wrap it in gauze. So I can be very scalpel with it. But
You're not the first person who's observed that FP&A and kind of business intelligence and data analytics are kind of becoming one.
Well, they are, and it's actually changed the way we recruit too. So, historically we used to recruit MBAs, with a finance quantitative background. We sort of still do that, but we're starting to lean into people that have, a real sort of data science background and really understand how to, to maneuver the business into this sort of next world of BI.
Last question I got for you. What's the craziest thing you've ever had someone try to expense?
Probably pet related items.
Really?
Yeah, like we've had people try to take their dogs and pay pet fees at hotels, and we're like, you're on a business trip. You don't need to bring your pets.
No fly zone.
Yeah.
That's a good one. Scott, this has been a blast. It's been fun getting to know Spirit Airline and the airline industry. I really appreciate you being generous with your time.
Yeah, you got it. Thanks, CJ.
Run the Numbers is a mostly LLC production. Yelling an intro by Fat Joe. Artwork by some AI thingamajig. Podcast and video editing is done by Cleancast at cleancast.io. Nothing said on this podcast is intended to be business or investment advice. It's the sole opinion of me, a guy who feeds his dog too much ice cream and has a history of net operating losses, LOL. If you like this podcast, please hit subscribe. It would mean a lot to me. And also check out mostlymetrics.com. That's my newsletter where I explore business models and financial metrics. Thanks for riding with me. Share this with your friends. Peace.